Alright, welcome back to the lesson on rigging. So now that we've got all of our modelling and texturing done, it's time to get Suzanne set up and ready to animate. So before we actually start building a rig, there's a few cleanup things that we need to do. And you have to remember that if you're working in a production with a big team, there's a very good chance that you might just be the modeler or the texturer, and you may have nothing to do with rigging, or maybe you're the rigger and you have nothing to do with modelling. Either way, you want to either send a scene to a rigger, or as a rigger you want to receive a nice clean scene that's ready to go. So I'm just going to go and grab all of these filters, and we're just going to go through and delete a few things and prepare a few things. So first of all, if we're up to the rigging stage, we're long past needing references, so let's delete the hierarchy, and that'll delete everything that's sitting under there. Same with this head sculpt. We don't need that anymore now that we've done our retopology, so let's delete that. We've got Suzanne, eyelashes, eyes, teeth, top and bottom. That's all okay. One thing, if we're going to be working with a whole bunch of other assets, like let's say we wanted to import the Suzanne rig into, I don't know, let's say a jungle that she was going to swing around in, we want to make sure that when we import her, she's going to be the right size, the right height, say, compared to the trees. So in our case, I'm expecting Suzanne here is going to be roughly about the size of an average female human, maybe just a little bit smaller. So I'm going to go with, maybe she's about 1.5 meters high. And at the moment you can see that if you look at the Z-axis here, she's actually 2.18 meters. So she's enormous. She's probably as big as a male gorilla standing up. So we need to shrink her down just a little bit. So let's go and shrink them from the 3D cursor and set our 3D cursor back to the world origin. Let's make sure that we've got all of our objects selected. Let's scale everything down somewhat. Whoop. Make sure that you don't accidentally select the wrong axis, and let's bring this down until... Oh, hold on a second. Need to make sure that Suzanne, the actual body, is our last selected object, our active object, so that we can actually see our dimensions in here. Otherwise, if you say have the eyes as the last thing, you're working with a much different scale. So let's now shrink that down, and let's shrink it down until we get to... That's slightly less than 1.5 meters. Let's just make her ever so slightly bigger. So that's probably okay. The other thing that we want to make sure we're doing, and this is, again, if we're importing her into a scene with other objects, let's say, for example, that there is a ground plane in our scene that she's going to walk on, you can see that if we were to import her now, she'd import halfway through the ground plane mesh, and that's just not nice. It just makes things a little bit more annoying for our animators later on. We're just going to select all of the objects except for our ground plane here. I seem to have lost my translate tool somewhere in here. What's going on? I've got it there. I've got it there. Oh, that's right. We locked the eyes, and did we do it to the eyelashes? No, we didn't do it to the eyelashes. We locked a few objects early on while we were moving things around, and it's just the eyes. Cool. So I've got this back now. So let's go over to a side view here, and let's pull everything up and just get her so she's standing on the ground here. And whoops. And you can see with our feet here that she's actually not quite flat on the ground. So we may need to just tweak her feet ever so slightly to make sure that she's standing properly. So I'll get that about right, and I'll just... I'll just go in and grab the bottom of her feet soft selection on and go to tool and just make sure that we've got X mirror turned on. At the moment we'll just be moving the 1 foot. Now we can move both of them. So just go back to the right hand side and just shift all of that down a little bit. Make the soft selection a little bit bigger. So we can do that. And I might also just pull some of the toes down just a little bit. So I might just select an edge ring across all of those and just pull them down slightly as well. Maybe just go up a little bit. Just pull that up ever so slightly so everything is just that little bit closer to the ground. We've got all the rings selected there. Again, just shift that down slightly. Okay, so now we've got her feet planted firmly on the ground and everything where we want it to be. We've got our sizing correct. We want to make sure that you can see we've got rotation values in here and scale values. We want to make sure that all of these are set to 0, 0, 0. I found that these things are more of a problem in other 3D applications. Having values in these can really mess up your rigging. I found Blender to be a little bit more forgiving on this just because the way that it creates bones and armatures is a little different. But it's still really good practice and it can definitely still mess some things up. So let's just go and select all of our objects and just go all transforms, set everything to 0, 0. So our scales are zeroed out, rotations, locations, and that's good. Now one final little thing that I want to do to Suzanne here, and this is going to depend on exactly what you're using your model for. So if you're doing a game, then you may want to leave Suzanne as she is. Just notice I've got something sitting up here. It's our teeth. Why are our teeth sitting all the way up there? Let's just hide that. I wouldn't have thought that would break things. You do have to be a little careful with modifiers, particularly things like curves which shift objects around. Sometimes applying your scale and everything can, as you've seen, break things. I'm just going to undo. Let's see if we can get this back to... There we go, they seem to have snapped back into place. So just out of curiosity, if I apply all the transforms, that seems to be okay. There we go, it's when we apply our actual curve, presumably the scale that's upsetting it. So before we go and apply that, because it's breaking things, let's actually go and apply some of our modifiers. And that should allow us to, well actually it should allow us to delete these curves altogether. We shouldn't need them once we're done here. So let's go in and apply the curve. Oop, no. In this, usually you have to, it's best to apply from the bottom of the modifier stack upwards because you can get some strange results. This is one of those rare occasions where you actually want to apply the array first. And you can see even then it did just shift ever so slightly. That's due to, it reads the stack from top to bottom, so as we apply this one in the middle, it just kind of shifts things ever so slightly. But I don't think that's too big a deal. So we'll apply the curve. Don't actually need these teeth to be quite that smooth. So at least in the viewport, I'll drop them down to just one viewport smoothing and leave the render at 2. Do the same here, apply the array, apply the curve, and we'll also just drop that down. Okay, so now we've got all of that applied, we can just delete those curves because we no longer need them. Let's unhide everything. We don't really need the viewport smoothing on for that one, so I'll just drop that down to 0 and leave it on for the render. We're also going to want to apply the mirror modifier in this case because we want these eyes to be able to move independently, and at the moment they won't. So let's apply the mirror modifier, select one of the eyes, and just go P, separate by selection. Well, in this case it's left the pivot point at... oh, no, it hasn't actually. It's actually shifted it up. That's okay. Because we went and undid all of that to fix the teeth, I actually haven't applied the scale and everything. So let's go and do that. And now everything should be working reasonably well. Let's just double check the teeth. Everything's at 0, 0. We will need to name our objects correctly. So this here is Suzanne's right eye. So we'll just go I.R, I.L. Need to do the same thing here with the eyelashes. It does seem to have shifted ever so slightly while we've been manipulating things. Let me just... actually don't mind the way that looks, but it's clearly not part of the original design. So let's just grab all of this, go back to look dev mode, shift that back out of the head, and it looks like it's up to about there. Shift that outside as well. There, and then grab that last little bit and shift it out as well. Might have to just move some of this around a little bit to get it back in that corner. So I'm just going to shuffle some things around here a little bit until we get this back to where we were expecting it to be. Pull that back. I need to pull this down. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. Let's just view that subdivision again. And that seems to be roughly where I wanted it. Okay, so let's apply the solidify, let's apply the mirror, and let's again separate these. Make sure that we name them correctly, eyelash.L, eyelash.R. You can see here we've got the roughness map showing up, I think that's because if we just drop over into here, we've got, as you select these particular textures, it brings up whichever one you've got selected. So I'm just going to leave it on the diffuse for now. We'll probably do most of our work in the look dev mode, but it just makes a little bit more sense when we look at her like this. Okay, so I think we've now got all the modifiers applied that we need to have applied. We don't actually need to rig this ground plane. Although there is one last little thing that I'd like to cover before we move on to the rigging. And that is Suzanne's mesh density here. Or more to the point, how smooth the mesh is for the animator. We should really be able to see this if we just drop over into the right hand side. You can see that at the moment her feet are basically flat on the ground for the most part. If we now go and apply a smooth modifier, you can see that it shrinks ever so slightly. If I just turn that on and off, particularly on the toes here, and you can see that when we smooth it, her feet are now floating ever so slightly above the ground. Now, as an animator, that's going to be a real pain in the backside, because you'll be animating with this mesh. You would always be using your lowest subdivision to try to animate with. It just makes animating in the viewport that much faster. But then when you go to render it, you're going to get this result. And I mean, this may not be so terrible when it's the bottom of her feet, and you probably won't see it too much, but this may give you issues on casting shadows on the ground. If she was to be, say, picking up an object, you'd have the same problem where, like that, the fingers are slightly pudgier, and you'd think that she was holding it, and then you go and render it slightly smoother, and all of a sudden that object might be floating slightly outside of her fingers. So what we want is to try and get the animation mesh as close to the final render as possible. So, I mean, a little bit of shrinking is okay, but we've got a little bit too much at the moment. Now, if you're working in games, you may just need to suck that up a little bit and compensate for it, because you're going to need to be working with a slightly lower resolution mesh. But in our case, I'm going to be working towards animation and VFX. So I'm going to add a single subdivision layer to Suzanne, and actually apply it not at 2 levels, but probably just at 1. So now if we go back to the right hand side, you can see that it's floating slightly above. We'll move all of this down in a second, but if we crank it up to a 2nd level, it barely moves at all. So we really want a slightly higher resolution. So before we do that, I'm just going to quickly go over the mesh, because we do still want to try to keep things as low resolution as possible. And I'm just going to see if there aren't any extra edge loops that we might be able to remove. Like this one here, for example, is actually going down the tail, so we might kind of need that one. Okay, we probably can't remove that. Her face is reasonably high resolution. I wonder if we can't remove anything from here. Might try just removing that edge and then grabbing this one and sliding it across slightly. And it does look like we've been fairly economical with our polygon count. There's probably not too much that we can remove. All of these edges, kind of go somewhere important, and they're going to be difficult to get rid of. Might be able to get rid of that one as well. And again, just slide that across a little bit, maybe grab that one and slide it across. It's worth spending a little bit of time just going through as many of these as possible and seeing what can be taken out. I might try removing that one and then sliding all of those in a little bit. Might even go here. I do still have X mirror turned on. I think this should still work. Yep. Okay, is there anything going through the middle here? We can probably remove a little bit. Might be able to remove that one as well. And then just slide these around a little bit. You can feel free to spend a little bit of extra time on that if you're worried that your system may not be powerful enough to deal with it. I think we've probably got as few polygons through the hands and toes as we can get away with. So I'm going to turn this subdivision back on, and I'm going to apply that. The other thing that's happened is, as this process was designed to do, it sort of shrunk some of the areas just a little bit. So I'm going to do one last quick pass over the model and just make sure that these areas are kind of as chubby as they need to be. So let's go to about there somewhere. Make sure that we've got individual origins set. And I'm just going to hold down Shift and fatten these up a little bit. Make sure that you're using your smoothing there, and just pudge those out quite a bit. Whoop, don't take it too far. Taking that just a little bit too far. Just shrink them a little bit so we don't get any penetration going through there. I might also just fatten up these ends a little bit. Just so they're a little bit thicker. Try and do the same to the thumb. This one may be a little bit more challenging. Let's just go to the bottom view. Actually, we don't really need this anymore, because we really want to be able to fatten it out along this kind of diagonal axis. So I'll try going to normal direction. How good a job has that done? That's actually done a pretty poor job. So most of these probably aren't going to work too well. We might be able to use the cursor. Let's go and put the cursor to selected and go to, where is it? View. And with a little bit of luck, let's just put that on the 3D cursor and make sure that we're using the cursor. Go to the bottom now. I'm hoping I can use the rotation and actually get a manual direction. So let's get this as close as possible. I might even just center that slightly more. Now I can expand that a little bit. I am kind of getting that part of the foot just a little bit. I don't think there's much I can do about that, so we'll just fatten this up first. Go back to median point and just drag that across manually. check it from the top. I think that's okay. We have managed to get a little bit of weirdness through there, so let's just scale that back in. Getting a little bit of penetrating in there, so I'm just going to jump back into sculpt mode for a second and just sort of dab with the smooth brush a little bit, just to make sure there's at least a little bit of separation between those joints. Pudge this up a little bit as well. Use the inflate brush to pull that area slightly closer together. Just make this a little bit thicker that way. This is floating just that little bit. I'm going to bring it down so it's also touching the ground. That should be fairly okay now. Just round that off a tiny little bit. There we go. We're probably going to need to do the same thing to the fingers. They'll have lost a little bit of their shape. I'm also just looking at these things now and going, this finger here, this one here, is a lot fatter than these two, so I might just try scaling these up first. Just go to the right hand side, make sure that we can go back to global here because we're basically just going straight up and down. And I can fatten that one up a little bit, again using soft selection to just make sure they're around about the same thickness, just a little bit less. Do the same thing on this finger, fatten him up, and now we're going to go and grab all the fingers and fatten all of them up at the same time. Make sure that you're still set to individual origins, and just make them a little bit chubbier. You can see it's kind of distorting the mesh a little bit up in here, so again we'll just drop into sculpt mode, just do a little tapping of smoothing there. Need to do the same thing to the thumb. Possibly need to do the same manipulator angle that we did before. Let's see if normal doesn't work this time, and no, it's still slightly off. So let's go and put the cursor to selected, make sure that's sitting roughly about the middle, and go cursor, cursor, and set all of those back to 0. And I think we want to rotate on the x-axis in this case. Just get that manipulator line going up that finger as much as possible and just scale that out. I make that soft selection a little bit bigger. I might just make the tip of the thumb a little bit fatter as well. Something like about that. Now our little fluffy bits here have also lost a little bit of their, well, fluffiness, I suppose. So I'm going to just go around and select the end vertice on all of these. I can now use the plus tool to select a little bit more of them. Again, make sure we've got individual origins selected. Just go back to using global here, and we should be able to just scale them up. Something like about that. And you can see some of this geometry is kind of caving in on itself a little bit. So let's just make those as big as possible, and once again just kind of come down here and do a quick little tap on some of those. You can also use the inflate tool if you want to have a little bit more individual control over them. So I'll just kind of go through and fatten all of these up. I actually like this because it's adding just that little bit of extra variation to some of these parts. Just pull that up a little bit, just make sure it's not penetrating anywhere. And that seems to be okay. I'll just do the same thing with the hands here. Again, go around and select the last vertice. hit Control plus a couple of times, just make sure that I'm still working on individual origins, and scale all of that up. So leave it about there, go back into sculpt mode. Just get rid of any penetration issues. And then I'll just go and do a little bit of manual inflating. Okay, that seems to be reasonably good. Okay, I think that's kind of fixed our proportions. One final thing that I would like to do is just a little bit more work on the eyes. So the eyes themselves are okay. We've got the white of the eye, the sclera, I believe it's pronounced. We've got the iris and the pupil, and I'm fairly happy with that in and of itself. What we're missing from these eyes at the moment is what's known as the cornea, or the lens of the eye, which is this extra transparent, glassy sort of material that the eyeballs kind of sit inside of. It's the cornea that provides the majority of the reflection on the eyeballs. That can just add a little bit of extra character. It makes the eyes look a little bit wet. It gives you some specular highlights on the eyes, which if your characters don't have those specular highlights somewhere in there, the eyes end up looking quite dead and can be quite creepy. So we're going to add the cornea, which should be very simple. We just need to go cursor to selected. Sorry, these things are currently set to... their location is set to 0, 0, 0. So first thing we want to do is right click and go set origin to center of mass. Let's go volume. Now this may not be perfect. In fact, if we just go to the right hand side, you can see that the center of the sphere is this edge loop running around it. If we zoom in, you can see that it's just slightly off center. That's because we've taken this front bit off. So in fact, I'm going to go into edge mode and make sure that the cursor is actually dead center on the eyeball. Make sure that we set our origin to the 3D cursor. It also looks like it's come in with a little bit of rotation. That'll be because that was still set from our scaling before. So now we've got one eye set up. Let's go and create a new UV sphere. It's obviously a little too big, so let's scale it down. And we want it to be just slightly bigger than the eye. So something about there. Rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis. Whoops. Rotate x 90. And we're also going to go to the side view here. Just distort this ever so slightly. The cornea has a little bit of a bulge as you come through here. So I'm just going to add that. Maybe add an extra edge loop in here. Maybe just scale that in just a tiny bit. And once we add a smooth, that looks fairly okay. So let's go to the other eye and make sure that the 3D cursor is set to the very center of that eye. We can now duplicate this object and go Shift S. Which one is it? Selected to cursor, and that'll snap it over to the other eye. So let's make sure that these are named correctly. This is the Cornea.R, Cornea.L. Make sure that these are put under the geo. And let's just grab all of the eyes and make sure that all the transforms are set. Okay, so now we just need to quickly give these a material. Now, depending on whether you're using EV or cycles will depend how you set this up ever so slightly. So I'll try and set it up so that it can work with both. I'm going to bring out our material editor over here, create a new material. The main thing that you need to do for this is essentially a glass shader for the most part. So we need to get rid of our roughness. Let's just throw this over into rendered view so we can get a better idea of what's going on. Oh, I also need to add a, just quickly smooth shade these. I'll also select both of those, go Control L and make them share materials so that now we're working on both at the same time. We need to kill the roughness, potentially put the specularity up a little bit. And the main thing that we need to do here is go and put the transmission all the way up. And you can see that now we have what looks like a perfectly reflective glass shader, but it has no transparency. I've also got a HDRI plugged into my world slot here, just so I've got something to be reflected. I've set up my my default scene so that it always has a HDRI. You can just go and plug all of that in and then go and save your startup file so that you can also always have some sort of default lighting. So there's just a couple of little things that we need to set up to make this transparent. One, we need to make sure that refraction is turned on under screen space reflections. This is for EV setup. In fact, if we just go straight over to cycles, you can see that it just works straight off the bat. Let's just turn wireframe off so you can see that a little bit better. And you can see that we've got this really glossy reflection stuff happening there. If I hide the eyeball, you can see that disappears. So cycles just works straight out of the gate, which is great. It does make the eyeball just that little bit dark, so you can theoretically set your alpha to about 0.5 or something if you want to just brighten that up a smidge. The other thing you can do is leave the alpha, and under, what is it, visibility, I think? Yep, under ray visibility, you can turn shadows off, and that'll stop that object from casting shadows, which is what's it's actually casting shadows on the eye and making it a little bit darker. So you can do that. You will have to do it to both individually, and now we're getting some slightly better results. But if you're working in EV, let's just drop back to EV. We've set our refraction in here. We now need to go to the Material tab and scroll all the way down. And a lot of people tell you to use the blend modes in here and set it to either alpha blend or alpha hash. You can do that, and I mean, it kind of works. It's not necessary though. That's more for using alphas. What you want to do is click Screen Space Refraction, and that gives us our transparent eye. I've also found that usually setting this to a really low value, you can see that the eye is actually sort of popping a little bit there. So you can kind of adjust that to taste. I like to just have it set really, really low. So 0.01 is usually okay. That gives us our eyes set up. I'm actually finding these almost distractingly reflective, so I'm just going to drop that down. And that's actually Doesn't seem to be affecting it. Huh, well, that's interesting. I actually thought I still had control over the specularity here, but I think as we've added transmission, it's sort of taken over from our specularity, which to a certain extent does make sense. Once you have transmission on, what you're dealing with is internal refractions and reflections, more so than surface reflections. That really doesn't matter too much. Although we can still affect the roughness. But that's like the roughness internally. So what we can do to try to reduce these reflections a little bit, because they're just a little overpowering at the moment, the IOR, or index of refraction, is scientifically speaking, it's the way that light bounces inside an object and then goes off at a slightly different angle than what it entered at, which is what causes refraction. So the angle that it bounces off with glass is 1.45. Now these, being eyes, I think will be slightly less than pure glass. So if we just go and lower this somewhat, maybe to about 1.2, you can see that the lower we take that, the less reflection we get. So I'm going to set mine to about 1.2 and work with that. Okay, I think now we've got everything set up. I'm just going to set our cursor back to the world origin down there. Let's just go and create a plane quickly. And yeah, when we fattened up those feet, we did push them through the ground plane just ever so slightly. So let's just... We might also need to, let's just get this material out of the way. We probably need to pull this thumb down a little bit as well. So we're almost ready. Let's go and, whoops, grab that edge loop. Select all of that. Just go to the front view and go grab, move it down on the Z. Use soft selection just to pull everything a little bit. Oh, hang on. I've still got X mirror turned on, but I think our soft selection there may be messing with things. Let me just turn on topology mirror. Sometimes that can help fix things. There we go. That seems to be a little bit better mirrored now. I'm also just going to grab some of these around the back as well. Just shift that down a little bit. Should actually be a slight gap around there, but I will still pull that down a tiny little bit. Let's just go into sculpt mode and just sort of dab at the smooth very lightly, particularly on the fingers here. Just sort of dab at that until it just about goes away. I might need to swap over to the clay brush and just push that back just a little bit. That seems to be looking okay. Just noticing we've got a little bit of a glitch in the legs there. Let's just hide this plane for a moment and just check that we didn't smooth the bottom of the feet in any weird ways. Looks okay. So let's delete that. Let's just quickly go back into texture paint. Make sure that we've got, I'm pretty sure this is going to be on the diffuse layer, I think. We've still got our color palette, which is nice. Let's turn off the texture mask for now. And stroke, let's remove the jitter. Choose Pretty sure it's that color, and just paint over that. Yeah, there we go. That seems to be getting rid of it. And it's got rid of it on both sides. Okay. I think, let's just go back into look dev mode. I think we are now ready to finally jump into the actual rigging. So rigging is one of the more difficult things to do in 3D animation. It's quite technical, particularly when you're dealing with things like forward kinematics and inverse kinematic arms, various different ways of animating. There's a lot of things that can go wrong when you're building a rig from scratch, and those are mistakes that you can't tend to have those sort of time sinks in production. Generally speaking, if you're working in a production and time is of the essence, you'll usually go and use some sort of pre-made rig, a script or an add-on or something that's going to build at least most of the rig for you straight out of the box. And when the majority of characters that you're going to be working with are humanoid, bipedal, and they have 2 arms and 2 legs, and occasionally you'll be working with quadrupeds, but bipeds and quadrupeds make up the vast majority of characters that you're ever going to be working on. Occasionally you'll be working on bugs and insects that might have 6 legs, you might get squids or something with 8 legs, or strange monsters. But even strange monsters are usually bipedal or quadruped, so it's quite easy to take advantage of these automatic solutions. And considering that we're working in production here and time and money is of the essence, we're going to be using the Rigify add-on, which fortunately is free and comes default with Blender. There are a couple of other add-ons out there which are also good, but I have to say I've used Rigify a number of times now, and I found it to do everything that I need it to do. You can see here I've also got the blend rig enabled. That's another possibility. Again, I found that Rigify kind of covers everything that I need to know. I actually can't remember off the top of my head whether Rigify is enabled by default. So if it's not, just go into your Blender preferences, type rig in there, and you can find it very quickly. With the Rigify enabled under Armature, that gives us 2 options. We've either got the human meta rig or the basic human meta rig. And if we go and create this one, and let's just isolate selected for a moment, you can see that this has a fair bit of what we need. It's got arms, necks, heads, feet, etc. But it's missing hands and fingers, which is something that I really want. So we're going to delete that, and instead we're going to use the human meta rig. Look at this and just check our size of our character here. I have no idea how, but at some point we've actually ended up with Suzanne being 3 meters tall. I'm genuinely not quite sure how that happened. So let's just go back and scale her back down again. We're going to want this to be around about half of that. So let's just grab scale and just go 0.5. That should drop her down to about 1.65 meters. I might even go just a little bit smaller than that, about 1.5-ish. That is one of the good things about creating these rigs. They kind of give you a rough idea of how big the character is going to be. You can see that this thing's coming at about nearly 2 meters, which is actually ridiculously tall for a human being. So let's just grab all of our objects again and make sure that all of our transforms are reset again. And let's bring the meta rig back. And you can see that this one does come with fingers. Let's just isolate this for a second. It comes with fingers. It also comes with a facial rig. There's a couple of extra things in here that we're not going to use. Let's also just go down to our rig options here, go viewport display and turn on in front. Now we can always see what we're looking at. A couple of things that we're not going to need. Suzanne here only has 3 fingers and 1 thumb. So we're going to remove the little finger over here. And I find that this facial rig is incredibly complicated and detailed. So we're going to build our own much more simple rig and delete all of this. And the nice thing about using the Rigify tools is that even if we go in and delete a whole heap of these bones, the Rigify add-on still works. So you don't have to worry about, if you remove things, breaking the system. So to start with, I'm just going to come down and select all of those. Let's just turn X mirror on. I'm not actually sure if I delete those. Yes, it does delete them from both sides. That's good. I'm going to delete this entire facial rig except for the head bones here. So let's just kind of select it from the side a little bit, make sure that we don't accidentally select anything that we do want. And delete all of those, and that's gone quite nicely. These are kind of breast controls, which are particularly useful if you've got a female human character. In our case, although Suzanne is a female, she doesn't really have much in the way of breasts, so I'm going to remove those as well. So now we need to get all of these joints to line up with our character. So if I just go and select them all, we should still be working from the 3D cursor, and I'm just going to scale everything down until those shoulder blades kind of match up. And if we go to the front view now, actually, before we start moving things around, there's one thing that I've discovered particularly when moving the hands around. If you go in and just sort of grab, actually let's just grab this second ring, grab and move these joints, it can sort of throw the joints off their axes, which when we go and actually convert this rig into something animatable, tends to make it so that the fingers can kind of makes it so that these fingers can go off at some strange angles, and rather than the fingers curving in nicely into the palm, they'll sort of like shoot off to the side and do strange things. Where possible, rather than actually grabbing and moving these joints, we're going to try and rotate them, which will hopefully keep them aligned on their correct axis. So let's just go back to the front view and work on the legs. Now these are fairly well straight onto the camera, so I'm not so concerned about just grabbing all of this and just moving it over. It's, as I say, it's mostly with the fingers that I want to try and stick to rotating as much as possible. You'll also notice that none of these rigs actually come with toe controls. They're kind of built for human beings that will usually be wearing some sort of footwear, so we will have to build our own toe controls as well. So let's just go and stick these roughly where we want them. I think that's fairly okay. Let's go and grab this whole arm here, make sure that you don't accidentally select the legs, and just go active element and make sure that that bone is the last one that we select. Again, make sure that you're not accidentally selecting things you don't want. And now we can rotate this down until it lines up there. Select the elbow, and in this case we will just have to move it. It can help to turn on your wireframe here so that we can see exactly where our elbow is. We've got those extra edge loops that we put in there. Let's go and grab the hand, move that ball joint there down onto the wrist. Now Suzanne's got some fairly big hands. Let's just jump over to the right hand side first. Just make sure that this is lining up on all of our axes, front and sides. So this will need to shift a little bit as well. I'm just going to grab both of those at the same time. Just make sure that that's still sitting in around about the shoulder. Shuffle that down to about there. So we're going to want to take all of these and just kind of scale them up. Make sure that you've got this joint as your last selected, so it'll scale from the active joint, the last one selected. Those in there. Go back to the right hand side. Grab all of those. We will have to move them in this case. Try to center them there a little bit. Same thing here. This thigh bone is kind of getting in my way and confusing me. I can just go in and hide that temporarily so that we can see what we're doing a little bit better. Shuffle this along and kind of try and stick it relatively centered. Actually, I'm going to center it on the top bone here, and then make sure that that's the last one selected and start rotating from there. Just kind of try to straighten that up a little bit. Hopefully that's not too bad. I'll just grab this one and shuffle him slightly more towards the middle. We'll just tweak these ever so slightly. Same thing here. And rotate from the active there somewhere. Deselect that one. That still needs to come over a bit. So it's centered. That looks okay from that view, but if we go over to the back or the front view, we can see that that's not quite right. Again, I'm just going to go and hide a few of these bones, just to make it a little bit easier to see. Let's go from the back. And again, select all of these. Make sure that's the last one that's selected. And start straightening these out a little bit. We do want to make sure that this bone comes all the way down to that joint. Actually, no, it needs to be going up to this joint up here and rotating from there. Then that one goes to that joint, that one goes to that joint, and this needs to come all the way down to the tip. That's a bit better. Let's unhide everything. Deselect those ones in the middle and rehide those. Again, go from the back or the front view. Grab all of these. Make sure you grab the tip of that one. Move that all the way up. Rotate that into place. Just rotate that. Okay, unhide again. Deselect those. Reselect all of those so that we can hide them. This time let's go from the front. Just make sure that this is sitting back where it's supposed to. Rotate that out. Grab that longer. Rotate, pull that out. And obviously this thumb has not worked quite right. Get these into the right spot. I'm just going to set this to... Oh no, sorry. Because we're in edit mode at the moment, local view doesn't really do all that much for us. And by much I mean anything at all. So we're going to have to do this a little bit more manually. And just make sure that gets down to the correct joint. I just want to make sure that this is going to sit somewhere about there. Just a little rotate around, make sure that it's all relatively centered. That seems to be okay. I might just grab this part and move it so that it's in the center of the mesh as well. Now this one's kind of bothering me a little bit. I feel like I want to... If I can just rotate this around a little bit. It's kind of on a bit of a weird axis. So I go from the top and rotate like that. Because it's connected down there, it's kind of behaving a little bit strangely. If we go to the item over here, we can use the roll instead. Let's just kind of rotate that around a little bit more. And I might do the same here. Just try to get those lined up a little bit better. Okay, that seems to be looking okay. And what's nice is these bones aren't actually the bones we're going to end up animating on. These are just guides for the script. This will then go and create actual controllable bones that we can animate on. And if for any reason these rolls aren't quite right, we can go in and tweak them on our final animatable rig, which we'll quite likely have to do. So I think that for the most part takes care of the arms. And let's just check the legs from the side view. I'm going to shift these forward a little bit. When creating inverse kinematics, so that whole thing where you can just grab a foot control and lift it up and the whole leg will follow, we want to make sure that we've just got a slight bend going forward into our knee. We don't want something in reverse, otherwise the knee will bend the wrong way. The rest of this is looking okay. I might just grab these, and you'll notice there is actually an extra bone in there, so just make sure that you select everything. I'm just going to move all of this back a little bit until that connects with the neck. Just straighten that up a little bit. I'm just going to grab the tips of both of those and just shift them until they get roughly to head height. I might just pull this collarbone in just a little bit so that it's just inside the mesh. And that, I think, oh no, we do still need to do the feet. Actually, because we're going to go and build our own toe controls, this one probably doesn't matter quite so much. I might just pull it out a little bit, but not too bad. You want to make sure that this is kind of the toe. So you want to make sure that this roughly lines up with the toes, and you want to make sure that the ankle actually lines up with your ankle. This control here is actually going to be, I think this is the base of the heel. So we just want to move that back, because this is where we'll be able to do a sort of heel roll and just roll the whole foot up and down. So you want to make sure that that's kind of right on a nice pivot point. Okay, I think that's a good start. What's nice about this is we can create our Rigify and then test it, and if there's anything that doesn't work, we can come back in and shift these joints a little bit more just to try and make sure that it does work. Just realized I didn't check the chest, but I think I'm fairly happy with where all of those line up. I might just move that down. Just move that down a little bit. Your rib cage sort of comes down somewhere about here. It protects all of your internal organs, and this top part of your body, because it's surrounded by this rib cage, doesn't really move all that much. So you just want to make sure that that's in the right spot for it to bend. Okay. So I'm just going to give this a quick save before we go and actually apply our Rigify down here, generate our rig, just in case we need to, in case something goes wrong and we need to just drop back. So we'll just give that a quick save. And now with that saved, let's go in and generate our rig and give that a moment, and it'll go through and run a script. It'll set all of this up for us. So you can see over here in our outliner, we've now got a few things that have been added. We've got the meta rig, which was our original shape. We can just hide that for now. What it's generated is this rig here. This is our animatable rig. As you can see, it's quite complicated. It's got all of these extra layers on it, so I'll just go through that in a second and turn on and off the things that we don't necessarily need while we're doing this testing phase. It's also created these widgets. Basically, widgets are your key shapes, your shape controls, which are all of these various different shapes, and that just makes it a little bit easier to see what you're doing. Also, just going to go and turn in front on, and you can see that there's even more controls. So this thing is laden with far more controls than we actually need. I mean, once we get animating, we'll be very happy to have access to all of this. But just for our testing phase, I'm going to go through and turn off anything that's got tweak under it, and the fingers. And I generally like to work in inverse kinematics for the legs, so I'll turn those ones off. And then for the arms, I like to work in forward kinematics, again, mostly just for this testing phase. So if we just go now into pose mode, we just sort of grab a few of these things. I'll just make sure that we've got individual origins selected, and you can start to test this and see that all the bits are kind of working. It's a little hard to see at the moment, so I'm going to go and grab Suzanne, grab our new rig here, and go Control P, and go to Armature Deform with Automatic Weights. And this will give us a nice little testing bed so that we can make sure that our rig is set up correctly. So just give that a brief moment. And that is now parented. If we go to Suzanne here, we can see that we have an armature. So let's go back into pose mode, and let's just try moving a few things around and see what sort of results we get. So you can see that that leg is bending fairly well. Her knee is really kind of pushing out a little more than I would like. So I mean, we do have these controls that you can use to sort of rejig that. But I'd really like by default for them to not be doing that too much. We've got our toe controls here, and you can see that that's kind of doing some weird deformations. It's not quite taking some of our toes with us. We're going to have to do some weight painting to fix that. This here is our heel control, and that's actually not going too badly. It looks a little bit weird at the moment because our toes aren't weight painted correctly, but you can see that those middle toes, that's kind of that's a nice spot to be putting weight on the character. And as we roll backwards, you can see that she does in fact roll on her heel, which is also nice. So that's good. Nice simple one. It'll hopefully be the hip controller. Please ignore the fact that her eyes and stuff are popping off at the moment. We will need to get those rigged as well. But that looks like it's working okay. Again, those extra toes are kind of behaving a little bit strangely, but that's alright. And these still pop outwards a little more than I'd like, but it's not terrible. Oh, now one of the things that this rig does by default is it uses your inverse kinematics rather than forward kinematics. So even though we've turned off those layers, it's still got this set to 0. So we actually want to crank that up. Actually, let me just undo that movement first. Put that one up, select the other arm, and make sure that both of them are up. Now we can go in here, and that elbow deformation is actually quite nice. I'm happy with that. Shoulder's not too bad. Let's check the wrist. We could end up with a little bit of strangeness. Yeah, you can see that the hand goes through the those fluffy bits there, so we will need to make sure that the fluffy parts are connected to this bone. Let's test the big one. It's going to be the fingers. Let's just go rotate on the X, and you can see that that one bends quite nicely. That's good. Grab the next row, go rotate on the X. That one also seems to be going quite well. Rotate on the X. Ah, and look at that. I think that's one of the first times I've used this rig, and fingers have all kind of worked the way that I was expecting them to. I think rotating those joints rather than moving them may have helped us quite considerably. Let's just test the thumb. And it looks like the thumb is a little bit misaligned. You really want it to sort of wrap over the top of, either on top of or underneath this finger here, and it's kind of just bending off at a weird angle. Let me just reset everything. The reason that we want these really specific rotations on our fingers here is that when you come in and you're animating and you just go rotate X, you want to be able to grab all of those and just do one movement, and she'll make a nice clean fist. And you can see that thumb is just not quite perfect at the moment. That's something that we'll fix. In fact, let's just go over here, go to our, where is it, our text editor. You'll also see that it's created this rig_UI.py. That's an additional script that comes with this rig. It will be very important later on. We'll be able to use this to create some of our own rig layers. When we take this rig and go and append it into other scenes when we want to do our animation, we will just need to remember that this script is in here, because we will need to activate it in other scenes. So we've definitely added our eyelashes. Let's just start making a few notes over here about things that we know we want to try and fix. So we've got the thumb controls. We want to realign those. We know that we're going to need to spend a little bit of time on these toes to make sure that that toe controller works properly. So that's more of a weight painting. So let's just go weight paint toes. We're also going to want to build toe controls. Because it hasn't created those by default for us. Let's just grab the collarbone here and rotate that up, and that actually seems to be working quite well. All that extra geometry that we went and built into the collarbone there, it seems to be serving as pretty good. There's a little bit of weirdness in the deformation there, but you can see that she can raise her arm really quite well. Doesn't seem to be rotating properly for me. So that's pretty good. We will need to just weight paint the shoulders, which is very, very normal. This is actually quite good deformation straight out of the box, so I'm fairly happy with that. What else have we got? We've got the hips. I love this little hip control. Makes her, looks like she's, what's that Bee Gees song? Dance Fever or something like that? We can get her into a nice pose very quickly. But yes, I do love the hip controls. They provide a nice little bit of wiggle. Here's our upper body or shoulder controls. Again, please ignore the eyeballs. That seems to be deforming fairly nicely. We'll have our neck control here. That'll wobble our head back and forth. You can see that it's really doing a strange number on her chin there. Again, since we haven't built jaw controls or any other facial controls yet, that's very normal. It doesn't quite know which bone to stick it to, so it's kind of just divided it between the neck and the head. So let's go weight paint chin/mouth area. We also know that we're going to need to build facial controls. That'll include a jaw, it'll include eyes. It's a little bit off the face, but this rig doesn't come with any ear controls, so we know we're going to need to build those. And speaking of things that we know we're going to need to build, it certainly didn't come with a tail control. And we'll have a look at doing both an IK and an FK. So in the same way that I can just grab several controllers down here and rotate like that, or I can just grab a controller and move the entire limb, we'll build that into the tail as well, so you'll have the option of which what type of animation you want to do. Let's just check the head, and you can see that's doing also some very strange stuff, but that's not unexpected. So I think for the most part, this has basically worked for us. I don't think we're going to need to go back to our meta rig here and make any changes. We will just hold on to it for a little bit longer, just to be on the safe side. But it looks like most of the changes that we're going to make can be made on our new animatable rig. I might just quickly just go and test how the inverse kinematics are working. It seems to be going okay. You can either rotate your shoulders or your elbows using these controllers with the arrows. I personally don't like them all that much. Let's just set everything back to default. I much prefer the... where is it? Just make sure I've got the right objects selected. I think I need these. Yes, these little controls here. I'm going to turn on the pole vector. You can see that that goes and puts in a new controller over there. I'm going to do the same over here. Pole vector. In our case, I'm kind of using the forward kinematics, but you can do the same with the feet. I'm going to turn on our pole vectors. And you can see that our knee controller is kind of all the way over here. That's part of the reason why when we pick this foot up, it points straight at the knee. We're going to need to build these so that they're more sitting straight. And then when we lift the leg up, that knee will point forward as you would expect. And we might need to do the same here. So that'll sit back around there somewhere. When we lift it up, the elbow will go backwards. Just kind of a personal preference. So let's put everything back where we want it. Let's make sure that I only want inverse kinematics for the arms. Forward kinematics for the arms. And just make sure that that's still set. Set on the other side. Good. these are now behaving as I would like. I'm actually going to go and hide those big arrows because I'm not a big fan of them. And now that I've got these controls kind of set up the way that I want, I'm going to hide those little cogs as well. Those are just setting controls. Alright, so now that we've got our controls and everything set up in the way that we'd like to animate, I'm going to start diving in and working through our list here. And I'm going to start with what I think is probably the most complicated of these problems to fix, which is going to be fixing up the knee so that by default it comes forward rather than popping off to the side like that. I just don't like that as kind of a default setting. So let's set everything back to default here. Now this is going to be a little bit of a complicated fix, and it involves the differences between inverse kinematics and forward kinematics. In fact, I'm going to turn our forward kinematics on for the legs just so you can get a better idea of what's going on. So if you don't fully understand the difference between IK and FK rigs here, just try to follow along with the steps. So what I'm going to start by doing is moving these pole vectors more towards the middle. So if I go and grab and move on the X, in fact, let's just go global here and move on the X. And I don't know exactly how far along here I want to move it. Let's go with about 0.5. In fact, sorry, we want to go negative 0.5. And that's just maybe slightly too far. Let's right click to undo that. Let's go grab X, negative point, let's go 4.5. And that I'm fairly happy with. So let's do the same over here. Grab X, 0.45. And that moves these to where we want them to, but our location has these weird values in them now, and if we go Alt-G to reset our position, they kind of snap back over there, which is not what we want. We want to zero out this location value. And another thing that kind of breaks here is if we now go and move back and forth between either our inverse kinematics or our forward kinematics, you can see that the leg kind of moves. Fortunately, the Rigify rig has additional tools built in that make fixing this next step really, well, without them it would just about be impossible, so thank goodness they're here. So what we want to do is take this forward kinematic position and move these controls so that they then line up with the inverse kinematic. So if we just click on this snap FK to IK, you can see that it snaps our controllers, and we can do the same over here, snap, and those shift. So now that we've got all of these kind of set up where we want them to be, and they all kind of have some slightly strange values on them that we don't like, we can go select all and hit spacebar to bring up the search, and we want to type in apply. And the one we're looking for is apply pose as rest pose. So what that means is the position that everything is in here, set it to the rest pose, which is kind of our default position, and that'll go and zero out all of our transforms up here. So we're going to do that. You can see that our mesh snaps back to its original position, which is nice. And you can see that all of these values are now set to 0, which is good. There is one problem with this method, and if you were watching closely, you might have seen that these little red lines that a moment ago were coming up to our pole vector and stopping are now kind of shooting off into infinity. And that's got to do with some stuff happening under the hood. In fact, if we just go and drop into edit mode, you can see that we've got these extra bones here that weren't there before, and what's really annoying is that I can't actually select them. Even if I go select all, it doesn't select them. Now these bones here are kind of hidden and unselectable bones that are creating this this line, which is it's a useful line. I like having it. As we move our pole vector around, it points back to the knee, and it kind of helps us figure out exactly which direction our knee is pointing. So I wanted to keep them, but at the moment they're kind of doing some weird things. So if you go over here to our outliner and you type VIS and scroll right down to the bottom, you can see we've got these 4 bones, and as I click on them, it's selecting our thigh pole vectors. Well, we can't actually see these yet, but on our arms, but don't worry, they're going to come back, and we'll have to deal with them as well. So if I just select the left pole vector pointer thingy there and go to pose mode, now I've got it selected, and I can come over here to bone constraints. And what I want to do, let's just minimize that copy location. It's this stretch to that we want to try and deal with. So if I turn it off, you can see that it actually snaps back to that position. So what I want to do is go back into... Actually, no, our edit mode is actually kind of okay. What we ultimately want is for this ball of the joint to be lined up with our pole vector, so that's actually okay. It's in pose mode. We switch that back on. It's this rest length here that's set incorrectly. So if we just go here and type in 0 and hit enter, you can see that it snaps back to our pole vector, which is what we want. Now, it doesn't actually set that value to 0. I believe it's setting it to the bone length now, which is from here to here, which is obviously not 0. But you can see now that that is working as one would expect. So we can go over to our other one and set that to 0. And now our pole vectors are set locations that are at 0, 0. Our IK controllers, our FK controllers are all set to 0, 0, and this is kind of all working as we would expect, and that knee is now going forward as we would like. So that was a little complicated. If you're getting lost and confused, just go back and work through it step by step, because now we're going to go and do the same thing to the arms. So let's turn on our inverse kinematic controllers for the arms. I'm also just going to go and hide all of that, just because that's a little bit of visual noise that we don't really need right now. And you can see now that these have also got that problem. That happens when we apply the rest pose, and they've sort of shot out to infinity. And if we go into edit mode, you can see that we've got these weird little wing things that are going on. So, like we did with the knees here, we're going to want to move these pole vectors somewhere back over here. So let's just go to the top view, grab both of them, go grab and move in the Y. I'm just going to move them back a little bit, go to the right side, and I'm just going to move them down until they kind of roughly line up with our elbows. Out there. Go back to the top view, and like we did before, I'm going to go grab on the X and go -0.45, and that seems to be a good value as well. We can do the same here, move it 0.45 inwards. And as we had before, when we wiggle back and forth between the IK and the FK, the shoulder's still moving. So we want to once again snap that, and we'll see all of our controllers move. Do the same on that side, snap, and all of our controllers move. Now we can select everything and apply that pose. Our arms will snap back to where we want them. These all get set to 0, 0. Hang on, you just want to make sure that that's set to inverse kinematics, and now our elbows pop backwards as we would like. And finally, we just need to deal with these pointers that are shooting off into nowhere. So let's select these. Now you can see that that's not working here. We could just try to sort of dial it in, and we might be able to leave it at that. But the real problem is if we go into edit mode, you can see that applying that rest pose has now made these bones absolutely enormous. She looks like she's got some sort of jets on her. So we can come over here and select those. And I'm just going to scale them right down to start with. Remember, what we want is for the points of these to match up with our pole vector. So rather than trying to scale that in and just sort of guess, I'm going to make these selectable. I'm going to select that end point. Just go over to Tool and make sure that we've got X Mirror on so that we can do both at the same time. I'm going to make sure that the cursor is on our pole vector there, and now go Selection to Cursor. That will snap that into place. And if we go back to Pose Mode, you can see that it has worked on this one over here because I'd already gone in and dialed that down to 0. It hasn't worked on this one yet. We also need to set that to 0. And now they snap into place as one would expect. So I'll just make those unselectable again because we don't want to be able to select them while we're animating. They don't really do anything for us. They're just visual guides. And if we just go in and test a couple of these things, it looks like everything is working as we would expect now. So again, I realize that that's a fairly complicated way of going through and getting our pole vectors where we want them. Again, if you're getting lost, just walk back through it and do it step by step, and you'll eventually be able to get there. Of all the things that we have to do to get this rig ready, that's probably the most difficult. The next thing we're going to do is fix up this thumb down here. We just go into local mode. Actually, one of the things that I love about this rig is you don't need to select all 3 finger joints here and rotate. You can actually just grab the one and it rotates the other 2 below it, which is really nice. You can just kind of select one thing and rotate that into place, and then you can come in and shift everything else as you need. But problem with this, if we just go and select all of our fingers here and rotate that on the X, when we pull that in, you can see that the thumb is kind of wobbling off into nowhere. We really want it to sort of sit somewhere more like about there when we close the fist. So let's just go and reset everything. So this one's much easier to fix. If we just go into edit mode, just double check we do have X mirror still turned on. All we need to do is rotate these around its own axis, which, as you saw before, can be done quite easily using the roll command over here. So let's just select all 3 of those. Little tip, if you just change this value, it only changes the last one selected, but if you hold down Alt and click and drag, it now rotates all of them, which is really cool. So we want to set this at, I'm not exactly sure, let's go with about -75. That looks like it's going to rotate down that way okay. Let's go back into pose mode. Let's once again grab all of these, just rotate on the X, and as we close that, it's not perfect, we're getting a little bit of penetration there, but that's just about right. I do still want to pull it over just a little bit more. So let's go back into edit mode, grab all of those, and let's just push this to just going to make sure that I have I'm not sure which one I had selected before. Our roll values seem to be very different to what they were before. But it doesn't matter too much because we can still just come in here and move that. Let's go maybe -20. Let's see how accurate that is. Grab all of those controls and just go rotate X. And once we get into that fist position, I think I'm fairly happy with that. You'll still need to come in and just sort of tweak these a little bit as you animate. But being able to do that as a base is really solid. This is a good place to start from. Let's just rotate X, pull all of those into position, and that's fairly good. Sort of pull that up into there. And that's actually a fairly good fist as kind of a default. So that's how we fix the thumb controls. Let's go and remove that. Now all of these other things that we need to do in this list are building new controls. So I'm going to save that for the next lesson, and we'll come back to those. Let's just go back to our outliner here, get rid of this search thing. Let's just finish cleaning up our outliner over here. So now that we've got these rigs in here, I just want to create a couple more groups. So let's create a new one here. We'll call this rig. We will take our rig here, which is our main animatable rig now. I'll leave that called rig, and we'll just go underscore Suzanne. And we'll put that underneath the rig. I'll create a new group. I'll just call this meta rig and put that under there for now. This is going to be kind of like our backup collection that we created before, which will, before we finish everything, we'll make sure to delete this. So let's just kind of turn all of that off for now. Now that we've got, this is kind of all the collections that we'll end up using. So we're going to go and create one last master collection, I guess. I like to call this link, and then whatever your character's name is, Suzanne in our case. And when you're going in and linking your characters, having this nice capitalized link collection name just makes it really easy to spot and link into your scene. So we want to grab our geometry and our rig and put all of those under there. Now our widgets and meta rigs, I just like to put them down the bottom, just sort of for consistency's sake. We're going to delete that eventually. We'll leave the widgets in there for now, but what's really nice with this collection system is that if we go and import just the link Suzanne, it'll import our geometry and our rig, and it won't import those. So that's just, it's really nice in terms of keeping your scene a little less cluttered. So I think, with the exception of creating a few new controllers, I think that's going to finish off all of our work over here in the outliner. Those are our final collections. So let's just go and give this a quick save, and I'll be back in the next lesson to start building our new controllers.